Okay. Not sure if anyone's going to tune into this for live, but I'm going to save it. And I'm doing it live only for one reason, and that is to put pressure on myself to actually do things properly without assuming that I can edit things afterwards. So that's the reason for it. And who knows, someone may show up and start commenting and sending me hate messages and who knows what. But generally, the point of this video that I'm making is that I'm so frustrated and so fed up with every documentary that I've seen about the Bay City Rollers, because even though some of them are quite serious and they handle some very serious subject matter, for the most part, about the band and their musicality, they're full of shit. And it really drives me up the wall hearing the same bullshit spewed out year after year through all these documentaries. And so to start out with, I think that it's important to have kind of like a history of what was going on in music before the Rollers came around, because there was so much hatred towards them when they did come out, that I think we also have to discuss that, right? I mean, that's a real huge part of the history of the band. So I think to kind of understand where the band was coming from, you have to go way back into the 60s, and you have to think about this other band. I'm not comparing these two bands, but this was an important band as far as the UK goes. And of course, the Rollers were from the UK as well, although they were from Edinburgh. But I want to talk about this band here. And you have to say, well, if you don't think you can compare the two bands, like musically, creatively, why are you talking about them? Well, the simple fact is that when this tremendous album came out, one of the greatest recorded albums of all time, there was a lot of talk about this being teeny bopper music. There was not a lot of respect for the band. Later on in years, they cultivated that respect with Sgt. Pepper's and stuff like that. But let's be honest. If you had to wait for Sgt. Pepper's before you thought, oh, the Beatles are pretty good, there's something wrong with your brain. This is an incredible rock and roll album. It has some of the best covers in the history of rock and roll. It has some of the best songs in the history of rock and roll. It's one of the greatest debut albums of all time. And anyone who says this is simply teeny bopper music and not serious is out of their fucking mind. Let's look at the songs that are on here. So I Saw Her Standing There, written by the band. This is McCartney and Lennon. Misery, written by the band. Anna Go to Him cover. Chains, excellent cover. Boys, that's a cover of the Shirelles. Ask Me Why, McCartney and Lennon. Please Please Me. That's not one of the greatest songs of all time, McCartney and Lennon. Generally, with this album, what they're doing is they have, let's say 6 or 7 songs that they wrote themselves on this, and their songs stand up to all the covers of some of the classic songs of like rock and roll of all time, right? So let's think about that. These guys got hated on until many years later they released, Sgt. Pepper's, and then the serious listeners said this, well, this is a good band. It turns out they're a good band. I'm going to tell you why they couldn't understand the band originally. Okay? It's this little thing that I know everyone likes to talk about today, but this is a perfect example. It's this little thing called sexism, because girls like this band. Therefore, in the mind of the tastemakers, they can't be good because, well, you can come to your own conclusions. What does that say about their opinion about women and girls, right? One of the best albums of all time. It stands up against Sgt. Pepper's easily, right? Okay. So going through the history from that point in time until we get to the Rollers, essentially what happens is, I mean, in the '60s you have Motown going on, you have the Beatles going on, and they're actually competing against each other. Think about this: Motown had a stable of songwriters. They had people sitting in front of pianos every day, and it was their job, as if they were sitting in front of a typewriter, to come up with pop songs that could be recorded. Right? It was a factory. It was literally a factory of music. And if you ever get the chance to go to Detroit and go into the Hitsville, USA, it's an incredible history of the United States and their music and the domination that Motown had. So you have Motown competing against the Beatles, which is just a few guys and a good producer and a good manager. And as a matter of fact, on the second Beatles album, they did 3 Motown covers. And I remember reading Barry Gordy was saying, people complained to him, why did you give the Beatles these songs for so cheap to record on their second album? And he said, if we can get our music onto a Beatles album, that's going to be a tremendous profit for us. This is going to sell so many more of our records if the people that listen to the Beatles can hear Motown. And you have to remember, the early Motown albums, when they came out, they didn't have a picture of the artists on the front cover, because in order to get your record put out front in a lot of record stores, you could not have African Americans on the cover of the record. And so they had paintings on the covers. And obviously between that point in time, which we're going to say is like early '60s all the way through to like the '70s, things changed completely, right? And Motown dominated. But my point is that in the '60s, you had these two major forces: the Beatles, with a bit of the Rolling Stones and some blues and the Yardbirds and Jeff Beck and people like that, and Motown, and that was driving everything forward. And what happened was, well, everyone has a different opinion on exactly what happened, but one of the things that happened was the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And according to people recording back then, a split came in race and the music that was being performed. Now, I don't know how true that is. I mean, I wasn't even born yet. I was born a few years later. But essentially, it did happen that, if you look at the second Beatles album, we have Motown, which is ultimately the greatest independent record label of all time, and a mostly African American based label. And it is controlling the airwaves, and the only major competition is the Beatles. And the Beatles love Motown, and they're doing covers of their songs on the second album. And this is the huge genesis of what happened in the '60s. But after the assassination, and also, I think Brits in general falling out of love with essentially R&B, which was they were essentially R&B bands, if you look at the early Who and the Rolling Stones and stuff like that. And they were leaving that, and two things came out of it. One was blues. So you have Jeff Beck, and then you have like Led Zeppelin, obviously, and stuff like that. And even Black Sabbath, like their first album is just a blues album. So you have some blues stuff going on. And the other thing that happens is you have progressive music, where suddenly, changing keys multiple times through a song is important. And suddenly things like time signatures become important. When 2 years earlier, no one's thinking about this. Nobody cares, except for maybe Pink Floyd, right? '67 Pink Floyd, that's kind of a big thing. But essentially what happens then is that you have Motown going off and doing some of the greatest music they've ever done. If you look at the culmination of this would be like Stevie Wonder's Songs in the Key of Life in the '70s, right? I mean, Motown was getting to the point of like Duke Ellington style songwriting. There was no competition for them. And then in the UK, and then also in the USA, you have the blues, and then you have rock comes out, right? So essentially there's a problem here. And that is that in the '60s, we had Motown and British artists making dance music, essentially. This is music that you could dance to. Like if you look at the Beatles, for example, you look at their first album that I was holding up earlier. Don't forget they also had "She Loves You" and "I Want to Hold Your Hand," which weren't on any of their albums. Right? These are just huge dance songs. And in the British and American scene, danceable music was going away. But it stayed there with stuff like Stevie Wonder. I mean, and then you got like Parliament, right, and Funkadelic and all this stuff. So unfortunately, what was happening was, from a race perspective, things were going apart again. And I think that's great in some ways because artists were able to create the music that they cared about. It reflected their upbringing, and they didn't have to taint it for any market. So I think that was really good. But a downside is, if you look at the history of American music, you have to admit that the biggest cultural export in our lifetimes from the United States is rock and roll, and from the previous lifetime is jazz. And what it is this big mixing of cultures and different types of music. And it was so huge. Like, people take it for granted now. When you say rock and roll, it almost sounds not important, right? Because we take it for granted so much. But that was a huge thing that was happening. And so when we have things separating out, that's a huge impact on American cultural history, right? So this was happening. So you've got Stevie Wonder and that sort of thing going on the one side, and then you've got Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, Jeff Beck, who I love. And that left a whole bunch of people like myself who, as a very young child, the first thing I would have heard on the radio would have been like "Please, Mr. Postman" by the Marvelettes. That would have been probably the first song I ever heard. And so we really enjoyed this music, and suddenly it just disappeared, right? So we still had Stevie Wonder with songs like "The Duke" and stuff like that, but that Motown that we, as children, we enjoyed was kind of disappearing, right? And then there's all these Led Zeppelin albums. And so I remember being very, very young. So let's go back. This is 1974. And people were still listening to Stairway to Heaven on a daily. And every year it was listed as the greatest song of all time, Stairway to Heaven. And for a kid like me, I was like, you've got to be kidding me. Because I was only like 5 or 6 years old, but I already heard like almost everything Chuck Berry had ever done. I already heard everything the Beatles had done. This didn't stand up at all. Hey Jude was another one that always came up every year as one of the best songs. And I'm like, you're really going to say that Hey Jude is better than She Loves You, right? Maybe people can believe that because maybe it's slightly more complex or something, or it's more solemn. But She Loves You, I mean, just when the drum comes in, for example, at the beginning, it's all you're already been killed. So we were missing all that kind of music, and there was nobody providing it except for kind of like fake pop bands that were coming along, and trying to do like this pop music. And so that's where it leaves us. And now I'm going through here to show the first thing that came out of this. And I've got so many records here, I don't even know what I'm doing anymore. But yeah, so this thing comes out, and it's so funny because I've never seen this before, and I have it, but it's not a gatefold. It's like a single sleeve. Okay. So essentially this record comes out, and I heard it actually on an 8-track sitting in the back of like my future brother-in-law's car, sitting beside my sister. So I'd never seen this band ever, never heard them before. And the song that was playing was probably Ain't It Strange and Please Stay. So Ain't It Strange was written by the band. It's interesting. It's listed as Faulkner, Wood, and McCown. So Les had a hand in that as well. And then Please Stay is an old standard by Burt Bacharach. Now, something you should know is that the band had already been performing since the 60s, and Please Stay was one of the songs that they covered way back in the 60s. And so we have like, let me see if I can point this out. We have Derek and Alan, who were like the forming members, and of everyone here, they were the only people that were there in the '60s that were um, performing that. But the fact is that it's on this album, and it comes from the many years that they were playing all that stuff. Okay, so that's fine. The problem that starts to come up with the record is that you have these two producers, Bill Martin and Phil Coulter. And this is going to be a theme with this band. Producers, I've got a huge problem with them. But anyway, they have these two producers, Bill Martin, Phil Coulter, and they are writing songs for the band, trying to make them, a popular band. And so they wrote Shang-a-Lang. There's some other stuff on here that doesn't matter that they wrote. They wrote Remember, and they wrote Summer Love Sensation and Saturday Night, which was the huge hit here, which even as a kid, I was like, I don't know why everyone loves this song. I like everything pretty much on this album except for that song, but I've grown an appreciation for it. But here's where the problem comes. After this album, they fire Bill Martin and Phil Coulter, because they are simply writing the same styles of song over and over and over again. Plus, they're trying to bring in session musicians to get the recordings done quickly. There's a whole bunch of problems, and they're gone, okay? But Shang-a-Lang, written by Martin and Coulter, is one of the biggest hits that the Rollers ever had, and it's a fantastic song. And I keep seeing videos or recordings of Martin, I don't know if it's Martin or Coulter, talking about how they turned the Rollers into stars. And I'm going to say that's complete bullshit, and I'm so sick of hearing it. And the reason I'm saying that is that these songs that they wrote, if you look at them on paper, they're okay songs, but they're not great. They're not number one hit songs. They're not ever going to be. You would think, until the Rollers do Shang-a-Lang. And there's two really important things that happened in that recording. Number one, and Martin and Coulter might say it wasn't the Rollers actually playing, but we know it was the Rollers style, which existed beforehand. Number one, Derek is using his floor tom instead of a hi-hat, and he's getting this kind of rumbling sound out of it that's constantly driving forward. People had played the floor tom before, but this song is based around this floor tom going. And then we have the slightly distorted guitar of Eric Faulkner that's also driving things forward. So for me, at that point in time where Motown isn't what it used to be, the Beatles are doing rock, Led Zeppelin, and, guys walking around without the shirt off or something, I don't know, is the big thing. The moment I hear this, I think rock and roll is coming back. Like these guys know exactly what I'm talking about when I want to hear rock and roll. So to come to a conclusion on this album, and it's a decent album, it's very well recorded. Some of the songs that Martin Coulter wrote are weak, but the Rollers make them into good songs. Especially Saturday Night, which could have been the weakest song of all time, and it sold next to no copies when it was released in the UK. But in the United States, obviously, it became like at least a top 10 hit. I don't know. The band is putting a spin on the song to make it something, and to also go back to that Beatles album that I was holding up earlier. There's also some fantastic covers on here. And I know today people are like, well, it's a cover. Who cares? It's so hard to do a good cover. Listen to the Jam doing Heatwave, a Motown song. It's trash. I like the Jam, but it was absolute garbage. But on here, we've got Please Stay by Bacharach. We've got, what's the other one? Oh, Be My Baby. Now, someone was saying the other day that they destroyed the song in their opinion. I would disagree with that. I think Be My Baby, because we're talking about Ronnie singing that. Who can really compete with her? She is literally the greatest. She was held back by Phil Spector and prevented from doing anything on this level. Again, she is fantastic. And rest in peace, actually. I think she passed away like within the last year. That these guys could then do a cover of that, and in my opinion, it be a great cover, goes right back to that first Beatles album. Everyone's like, oh, it's just teeny bopper music. Oh, today people say, well, they're just covering stuff. Those covers are so hard to do. Hardly anyone can do a cover like that. Um, I, I'll think of a cover band, a band that did a great cover, Soft Cell. Soft Cell did a cover of Tainted Love. Most people don't even know that's a cover, right? So that says something about them, right? Um, so yeah, I think I'll end it with the fact that they wrote some really nice songs on here. Ain't It Strange is really good. Just a Little Love is fantastic, and Eric Faulkner's acoustic guitar solo on that is fantastic as well. Um, so that's generally, yeah. Anything else to say about that album? It's a decent album. Um, it's not the one I pull out every day to listen to. So we have that. And I'm just going on to the second album now. That's got to be one of the worst album covers of all time. I don't know if anyone can hear me. I said that's got to be one of the worst album covers of all time. Yeah, I wouldn't even know it was them. And the thing that I think people have to take into understanding is that the band hadn't come up with their image yet completely. So they're essentially wearing glam boots, and there's a pair of monkey boots there Eric Faulkner is wearing. But they don't look great. It's not happening yet. But in the UK, they're absolutely on fire at this point in time. So talking about producers, as I said, I was going to continue to do. They had fired Martin and Coulter after the first album. And then this album came out, and they immediately went to number one on the charts with a cover of Bye Bye Baby, which was a Four Seasons song. And it's an incredible cover. And and the guitar solo on it is simply just a repeating of the chorus. And it's fantastic because Eric has such good tone to his guitar, so he didn't really need to do much else. So anyway, on this album, if I can look, this is produced by Phil Wainman, okay? And also, I'm just trying to think here. He wrote a few songs for this album with someone else. So When Will You Be Mine, Rock and Roll Honeymoon. What else? Was that it? That was it. And then they took some other songs that were available, and then they also wrote some of their own songs. And this is where it starts to get really fascinating. Okay, so the Disco Kid. So this is 75, I guess, that this album came out. And if you listen to the Disco Kid, it makes absolutely no sense that these guys are writing the song. You would almost think that someone had written it for them, but no, they wrote it. La Belle Jeanette, which is one of the best romantic songs I've ever heard. It's been a favorite of mine since this album came out. But by the way, I bought this as an import as a child. I found an import of this record in Canada. And that's not surprising because there's so many copies of this here. It must have been one of the biggest imports in the history of Canada until the first Clash album imports came out. They wrote Angel Baby, which is a decent song. They wrote Once Upon a Star, which is Beatles-esque, and I think it stands up to like the Beatles. They wrote My Teenage Heart, which is an excellent dance song. And Hey Beautiful Dreamer, which is just actually, and Les McCown plays a role in that as well. So you've got Eric Faulkner, Woody Wood, and Les McCown. Not the steadiest of albums, but what we're starting to see is that they're writing music that, while it may be aimed at, a teenage female audience, it's not particularly obvious that that's what they're doing. There's a diverse set of tunes on here, both the covers, the songs, well, all three of the songs they wrote themselves, the covers, and the songs that their producer was picking up. So it's a bit of an uneven album. I couldn't live without it. There are a little bit of weak points, though. One thing I would say about this album is that everyone says that the Ramones started off trying to do Saturday Night, that kind of thing. And they were copying the Rollers and how they were dancing on the stage and putting their fists in the air and stuff. But if you listen to the song "Let's Go" on here, because everyone talks about Blitzkrieg Bop, Blitzkrieg Bop is actually closer to "Let's Go," and I would say that "Let's Go," well, and it even starts off, "Hey ho, let's go." "Let's Go" is actually more of an influence than Saturday Night for the Ramones. And when you listen to it, you can picture Johnny there because he's only playing major and minor chords, and you can picture him trying to figure it out and trying to write songs on his own, because that song would say to him, you can actually do this if you spend some time. And then, of course, he and Dee Dee became two of the great, well, he and Dee Dee and Joey became the greatest punk rock songwriters of all time, in my opinion. And I think that song really would have had more influence than Saturday Night. So anyway, we've had two albums now where, the producers are involved. This one, I think they had a little bit more freedom because the band was literally fighting against the record label and fighting against their producers to have more of their music, on the albums, and definitely making sure that they don't have any studio musicians unless they're asking for like a string section or something like that, because of what had happened with their earlier producers, and then also some lies that got out in the papers about the band. Okay. I've got so many copies of this, I just don't know which one I'm going to bring out. But this is where we go next. And this album solidifies not only the look of the band, they'd, thank God, gotten rid of the platform boots. It introduced really the concept that a band would wear sneakers, right? Instead of like leather shoes or giant pink, I don't know, glitter boots. Well, it was glitter, right? Glam and glitter. And so that solidified that. But the other thing that it did is that it solidified the band as songwriters. Although there's some weak spots on this as well. The thing I think we have to keep in mind is that this is probably one of the biggest touring bands of that year. They were literally traveling to Germany, Japan, Canada, the United States. Actually, I'm not sure if they were in Canada yet until after this, but they were heading to the United States with their popularity. Meanwhile, Eric and Woody are steadfastly writing every song for this album, which to me is completely unbelievable. Woody's a child at this point. I think he might be approaching 17. And they're touring constantly, and they're constantly every day doing photo shoots and stuff like that. So on this album, I do believe they wrote every song except for one. And the one they did not write, Give a Little Love, was the song that was released as a single. And it was, I do believe, written by their producer. And now I'm trying to find evidence of that. Sorry, but it's on here as well. I will double check that and correct if it's wrong. But the point is, why, when you have this band that has just written an entire album, and let's look at some of the songs they wrote for this album, okay? So they wrote Don't Stop the Music, Shanghai in Love, Maybe I'm a Fool to Love You, Too Young to Rock and Roll, Wouldn't You Like It, Eagles Fly. Okay. Any other band writing this song, the record label would be looking at least 5 singles that they're going to release. If ELO had written any of that stuff, the record label would be going crazy. But instead, because this band is still controlled by their producers, the song they didn't write, the song that isn't half as good as any of the other songs, wasn't originally released as a single, as far as I know, in the UK. Now, things are different all around the world. I don't have time to look at every single that was ever released in every other country. But once again, an uneven album because they are touring constantly, and it's impossible to write that many songs quickly unless you're the Beatles, and they're not quite at that level of writing. So there's a few weak songs, but the stuff that isn't weak is just off the charts great. And the other thing that's happening is that they're providing even more direction for what is going to be punk rock in the future, because Eric is now being like, I'm going to be using more of a power chord approach. I'm going to be using more of a straightforward power pop approach, right? Um, and that stuff comes in huge when you get bands like the Buzzcocks and stuff like that. Okay, so that this video is going to be so long because they have so many records, right? Um, and then the next thing that happens after that, and I don't, I don't believe anyone says about this. I don't think anyone's been particularly honest. But after that album, Alan's out of the band and Ian Mitchell is in, and this album comes out. And something that's really important about this record is that Woody moves to bass. So until this point, except for the fact that Woody shows up in the songwriting credits with Eric, he's not playing. I already talked about how Alan and Derek came up with that sound that they needed for Shang-a-Lang, right? One thing I also should have mentioned, and I didn't, is that Les was one of the best pop singers of the 1970s, right? He just had he seems like a natural, like rest in peace, Les. It seemed like he just naturally picked up these songs, and some of the stuff that Eric Faulkner was starting to write was getting more and more complex. But anyway, Woody starts to play bass, and there's two things that happen as a result of that. Number one, that old rhythm section with Derek hammering away on the floor tom and Alan having this melodic bass to kind of push it is gone. And suddenly their music changes so that we now have these flowing bass lines, and we have a more traditional drum percussion, right? His style percussion becomes more traditional. He's using more hi-hat and stuff like that. And it becomes a bit more complex. So this album was once again produced by someone new. This is produced by, I forget his name because I'm an idiot. I don't know. It's funny how they don't make it obvious. Oh, Jimmy Leonard. Okay, so who is he? He was the guy that produced the Raspberries. Okay, so it's funny because I was saying before that once there was that split between like Motown and then rock, pop kind of disappeared. But the Raspberries would be one of those few exceptions. They were still writing pop songs, and not only that, they were writing some of the greatest pop songs ever. And so Clive at Arista brought him in to produce this album for the Rollers, which was actually, if you look inside, this is my city. This is where I live. That's them at City Hall in Toronto. I forget what I was going to say. I was so happy that they recorded it in Toronto. When I was a kid and I opened this up, I couldn't believe it, right? So here's the thing. Clive brings in a new producer. He's in charge of everything. He's in charge of Arista, and he has, I have to assume, even at this point in time, a lot of directives for the band. They still don't have complete autonomy. And one of his things was you have to do a certain number of covers, so that we know that when they got to future albums, that might have been the case on here as well. So we have to take that into consideration. And I actually have the wrong version of this. So the thing to note is that in the UK, they had Money Honey and Rock and Roll Love Letter came out on this. In North America, those songs came out on the Rock and Roll Love Letter album. So anyway, let's step past that. They do a Raspberries cover to start off the album, which I think is pretty incredible. They are not an easy band to cover at all. The vocals can go all over the place, and the Rollers nail it. And then they have some songs that they wrote themselves. So You're a Woman, Rock and Roller, Write a Letter, And then, of course, on the UK version, there's like Money Honey. And then they do this tremendous cover of I Only Want to Be With You, which is funny. Even here in Canada, it's still played on commercials sometime. It's like that catchy. You would never hear the Dusty Springfield version over here being played anywhere. Also a great version. But anyway, the band's maturing at this point in time, and songs like You're a Woman, that has like a nice minor major key change to it. And the bass line that they do for Don't Worry Baby, which is a Beach Boys cover, also not the easiest band to cover, right? The bass line change that they made in that is simply genius. And this is why I was talking about Woody at the beginning, is like, oh my goodness, when I go back and listen to these records, I find that, he actually had the chops to play bass like right away, and he did a great job. 1 second. It's Canada Day weekend, so people are partying in my house. So the point is, yes, it's more of a traditional thing. They are writing more complex songs, and they're continuing to do some excellent covers, but they're still being controlled by the record label, which leads us to the complete change in the band. And their last globally successful album. And who knows if it was globally successful because of their previous albums or because people loved it. I would say people were not ready for this album. So people bought it because they had the previous albums. And when I say they weren't ready for this album, these are some rather deep cuts. Excuse me, it's Canada Day, and I've also been drinking. Excuse me. There are some incredibly deep cuts on here, okay? First of all, they do a cover. Well, it's not actually a cover. They pick up the song, You Made Me Believe in Magic, and they open it up with a bass line that is just like outrageously good, right? And then they're also writing their own stuff. Dance, 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 Love Fever, Sweet Virginia. So deep. Like I wish I could just throw them on here and play them. But I suggest anyone that hasn't heard this album, go and listen to those songs and see how deep they are. They still have more. Don't Let the Music Die and Inside a Broken Dream, which are like, I think, really Eric's inner voice coming out. So the point about this album is they're pushing even further for their own voice and music. They're writing songs that are thoughtful and somewhat troubling. And that is exactly not what the record label wanted to sell. But they still managed to make this record. Now, this was produced by one of David Bowie's producers. And I also can't... Harry Maslin. Now, the funny thing is, I love this album. The only thing I don't particularly love is some of his production. I think it's a little bit string heavy. And if you hear some of the songs on here live without the string sections, I think in some ways it could have been a much better album if we had pulled those back. But string sections were it's the 70s. That's what you did to an album. So I'm 39 minutes into this, and I've covered a lot of music already. But let's keep going. I do believe this would be their next album. Most people didn't even know it came out. Hardly saw the light of day. Arista may have done some advertising for it. I don't know. But this is Harry Maslin again. I think he did a much better job with production on this. It's very organic. The Rollers have written several songs on here, but they've also done several covers. And I'm not hating on the covers, but essentially they were forced to do covers to release their albums. So hardly anyone hears this album. I don't know how many they even sold, but the amazing thing is this is easily one of their best albums. So Les is still with the band. Alan's come back, and he is now playing rhythm guitar. Woody is still on bass. I'm pointing to everyone the wrong way, but and Les is still there. So everyone has matured. They've been through a lot of difficult times. Yes, they are forced to do covers as well, but they've simply matured as a band. And there's some things on here I just don't know if you can get better than this. And I'm thinking of If You Were My Woman, which upon first hearing it, it's like, well, it's kind of like a disco-y type of song. And as the years go by, you start to realize how much effort they put into that song and how great it is, like from beginning to end. And there are other songs like that on here. And there's also an excellent cover of When I Say I Love You, the Pie. And that is like from a Scottish folk band that originally wrote that. We're getting somewhere. Okay. After I really have to pay attention here because even I'm getting confused. Look at that album cover. Like, wow. And the album's called Elevator. And you're like, so it's about some type of pills, obviously. Les is gone, replaced by Duncan. And we've got a mixture of songs, I think, written by Duncan and written by Eric and Woody. I'm just going to triple check that because I think that's definitely the case, right? And Turn on the Radio also has Duncan and Alan with writing credits on that. So finally, the band is able to convince the record label that they should be able to write all their own music and choose their own musical direction. And this album actually is moving forward quite a bit. And to be honest, it came out, I think, in 79 or 80, 79. And it was leading towards two things that were going to happen in the future. One was like that pop rock, like Toto type stuff, or power pop, and the other like modern power pop, 80s power pop. And the other thing would have been new wave. And they actually have some stuff that heads towards new wave on this. This is an album, not a pop hits album though. So the thing that starts to happen with bands like this as they go on is that there's nothing on here that you'd say, we're going to release this as a single. And so nothing got released as a single. This is FM radio. This is a kind of like serious record from beginning to end. And there's not a lot of pop stuff on there. So it didn't, generate a lot of interest. However, again, I wouldn't say this is one of their best albums, but I mean, if you're a fan of the band, it goes in directions you wouldn't even expect it to go to. So there's that. I'm getting deeper and deeper here. Oh my. Oh. Won't say much about this. This was put together. The album's called Vox. Same lineup as the previous, and it was put together apparently in order to fulfill their license requirements. And so they took some stuff that they weren't really planning on using, and their live version of Rebel Rebel from Japan, and threw that on there. And then, so this is how this was originally came out in Canada. It's got like a brown paper bag, so I've never opened it. It's behind seal. And you weren't supposed to know who it was. And so even on the label, songs are all written by Tom, Dick, and Harry. And it was actually this album. And one thing about the inside is that there was a thing that if you either bought that or sent in this coupon or something. I don't know. Your name would be on the album. So if you look at the inner sleeve, there's a whole bunch of names in there. And if you're getting the Canadian version of this, and those are the people that actually had the early one and wrote it. And I don't know the details about that. Like maybe someone can talk about it sometime. At this point, they're done with Arista. They're actually realizing they're not getting any of the money that they should have been getting from the record company. There's a whole bunch of issues about who owns the rights to the songs they had actually written. And they're pretty disillusioned, and they move on to Epic. And Epic did try to market this. And apparently, when it was in the paper bag here in Canada, it was actually garnering interest with DJs and stuff like that. But when they found out who the band was, no one would play it, apparently. Because, much like the Bee Gees, there was radio silence as far as this band. And they would never overcome that. But I also have to say, once again, well, what are the songs on here that were written as hits? And I'm not sure which ones they would be, right? However, a great album, completely, the band's completely in control, so you can finally hear them as matured musicians, what they want to play and what they want to write. And the production is, is great, but it's an album. So I play this every once in a while from beginning to end, and I enjoy it. But I don't individually pick songs off of this to play. So that's pretty much, my God, a long-winded version of, everything that this band went through. But my point is that if you listen to all of those albums, you can appreciate that these are actual musicians, people that are songwriters. They wanted to be famous for sure, but it wasn't up to their producers to make them famous. What happened was that the producers found this band that could take their songs and make them hits, because Martin Coulter, don't get me wrong, they wrote a lot of songs over time, but other bands had done some of the songs they had written recently, and it was just going nowhere until the Rollers stepped in with that rhythm section and completely changed everything. So my point would be that people look at it the wrong way. I'm sick of all these documentaries that talk about Martin and Coulter turning them into stars, and talking about all the bad things that happened to them and their money was stolen, but no one actually says, oh, these guys actually wrote a ton of music, right? They wrote some songs that were number one hits in some countries on their own, when Woody's like 16 years old. And, Eric is a classically trained musician and plays like several instruments. Alan played several instruments, I think Woody plays guitar, bass, and keyboards quite effectively. We've seen it live. Eric plays keyboards as well. So, that would be exactly the point of why I would be doing this. And that is that, what really matters to us fans is that people appreciate that these guys were actual songwriters and musicians, and they wrote a bunch of stuff that's just hidden. Most of it, the record label would not, they would not try to popularize. It was the stuff that was written for them or covers that they did most of the time that the label wanted to push. So I think that's the end of this enormously long video about all these records. But maybe someday for someone, it'll make sense, the stuff that I've been talking about. But even if people can't appreciate this video, I just think it's important that someone say, well, there was this real story, this real secret of the Bay City Rollers, and that is what they were: a great band, great songwriters, and they wrote a lot of songs that even that the record label didn't want them to be hits, but still became hits. And I think that's fantastic. And I hope that at some point in time in history, people will actually appreciate that. So that's it. And I know I saw people came in and left, but that's my video. And anyone that watches it, thank you.